today is critical thinking in uncertain times. And yeah, this is an aspect of practice which fits in with the other aspects of practice which we've already discussed and already done in relation to how we can deal with stress and uncertainty. And so, I mean, we haven't talked a lot about mindfulness on this retreat, but we've done some of it, and we've also talked about the arts a bit last night. But critical thinking, I think, is pretty crucial for uncertain times. If anything, it's I think more vital in polarized or stressed contexts than anywhere else, because basically, if you're going to face up to new conditions, then you've got to be able to question your assumptions. So that's what I take to be the central kind of skill involved in critical thinking. It's becoming aware of your assumptions and maybe other people's assumptions, and adjusting them accordingly. So there's a kind of awareness at the center of it. It's obviously an awareness with an intellectual aspect of it, with conceptual aspect of it, but it's also a matter of awareness of emotions and how we're impacted by our emotional states. So that's one reason why I've been making a point, particularly recently, that maybe critical thinking is maybe too narrow a term for it. There is a book by a guy called Rolf Weber, which I highly recommend, which is called Critical Feeling, and he really makes the point that there is critical feeling, which is really about examining your feelings and how you're using them and the conclusions you draw from them, which runs parallel with critical thinking and is really just as important. And you could see the two as being the same thing, really, or different aspects, different facets of the same jewel, as it were. Or another label you could use, which again I've started to use sometimes, is integrated critical thinking. So trying to make the point that it's not just a matter of logic, certainly, which is perhaps people's first association with the idea of critical thinking. Yeah, so it's not very much logic, actually. I don't think logic is terribly relevant to it, to be honest, but I suppose it's got a place amongst a number of other things. And it's also not just clear thinking, which is another term that people use sometimes, because actually it's quite possible to feel very clear about what you're thinking and not really examine it or be aware of it in other respects. So sometimes, at least the term clear as a substitute can be misleading, I think. So yeah, a little bit about the way this links in with the other practices. So yeah, I've got a metaphor which might help here. So imagine you imagine you've lost a tool, and this tool that you need for a particular purpose, and you think you've got it in your cellar somewhere. So you need to go and find it in your cellar. And yeah, in order to get this tool, you have to go down into your cellar and turn the light on and rummage around and find the tool, and then finally use the tool. Okay, so you've got those three stages. First, you turn the light on, then you find the tool, and thirdly, you use it. I think you could analogize those roughly to the first, turning the light on, is mindfulness or integration of desire practices. So you're providing some of the basic conditions that make it possible to develop awareness for the moment in those circumstances in the ways that you need to. Then finding the tool is analogous to developing integration of meaning. So things like the arts can be about finding the tool, because being able to imagine what we need to imagine, conceptualize what we need to conceptualize, is finding the tool, if you like, or having the tool available to us. And then using the tool, that's the critical thinking stuff. So when we actually apply it to a judgment and we draw our conclusions and we act according to them, that's kind of the biting point, if you like, that makes the most difference, as I see it. So although all three of those operations are vital, and it might be very difficult to use the tool if you couldn't switch the light on first and you couldn't find the tool, it would be very difficult. At the same time, if you don't follow through and actually use the tool, then the other operations are less useful. So that's why I'd see those three levels of practice as being crucial to each other, interdependent. And you could reinforce that, I suppose, with the point about meditation, that meditation is really helpful, but it's not a kind of magic ticket to critical awareness. And I think that can be, well, there are some studies that suggest that. I think there's certainly plenty of anecdotal evidence. I've certainly known people who meditate who seem to be very stuck in particular views that they won't examine. So and probably you do too. So the it's got a crucial place, but it's, I suppose, no one practice is the absolute answer. So this is another way of not absolutizing, or not thinking we've got the whole story. Is not just depending on one kind of practice. Okay, so yeah, a bit more about critical thinking in general then. So as I've said, I think it's probably more vital in more stressed context, but you can apply it in any context at all. And perhaps one of the unfortunate things though is that people tend to think of it, if they think of it at all, in an academic context. And where it's taught, it's usually in academic context. So it has been developed generally more in America than in the UK. In colleges, for example, there are courses in critical thinking. In the UK, there was an A-level, which I taught for a number of years and also examined, which I think was really helpful to some students, but only a very small minority of sixth form students took it, and very, very few adults that didn't get onto the adult agenda at all, really. So, and then it was closed down because not many people took it because the universities didn't include it in their offers. So it was got into a downward spiral. So really, even in academia, critical thinking isn't taught very much. And there's this idea that it should be taught as part of other subjects, but largely speaking, it isn't. So it really needs some attention, I think. So thinking about the skills we use when we make judgments and draw conclusions and fit our beliefs together and compare our beliefs and so on. And how this relates to the middle way, I think is quite crucially, really, in that if the middle way is finding the middle way between positive and negative absolute assumptions, which there are various examples of, and in the Buddhist tradition, those absolutes are conceptualized traditionally as eternalism and nihilism, but I tend to think of it in a more flexible way than that. But they're absolutes on either side. So if you're recognizing and avoiding those absolutes, then you need to be able to identify them when you are assuming them, when you're thinking in those ways. And hopefully also to be able to have a reasonably confident guess that somebody else is. I mean, you can't tell for sure when someone else is absolutizing if they are or not, but you can identify the danger anyway. So critical thinking really helps with that. And if you can identify absolutization, then you can help to resolve conflict, because absolutization is people thinking they have the whole story collide with each other. Indeed, we collide with ourselves when we think we have the whole story at one moment, and then at another they come into conflict with each other. So someone who wants to give up smoking says at one moment, I'm going to throw out these cigarettes, I'm not going to smoke anymore. And then maybe a few hours later, they pick them up, get out of the bin and smoke them again. So if we don't have that critical awareness at each of those points, we can end up even in conflict with ourselves, let alone with others. So I think all the skills which are which can be taught, or indeed they can be self-taught and they can be developed, of critical thinking, help you with all those things, with awareness of the judgments you're making. Now I'm going to show you a diagram which I have actually used quite recently in the network, but so it'll be familiar to some people. But this is just a analysis really of what might be involved in critical thinking. So it's my sort of summarizes my understanding of what I think the most crucial elements of it are. And probably the most important of those is the top one, assumptions. So when we're assuming something, when we implicitly believe it, and we're using it to draw the conclusions, then we need to try and become aware of that. And one thing that can help you become aware of that is to be able to find chains of reasoning. So you've assumed that one thing is true, so another thing must be true, and so on. So that's where reasoning connects with assumptions and can help you to understand assumptions and find them. But as I say, that studying reasoning can become an end in itself pretty quickly, I think, and that gets formalized in logic, but I think that's fairly peripheral to the sort of live practical use of critical thinking in our lives. So just an illustration of that, you could have an argument which was logically flawless, and a logical analysis would show as totally valid, and it could just be nonsensical in practical terms. But the other elements, so contexts, now that one's really about, that's got a strong emotional element to it, a critical feeling element to it, because it's very much about sensitivity to where you are and other people and the social expectations and so on. It's closely related to the other one, to the next one, interpretation. What do people mean when they say this? What are they trying to achieve in this context? So obviously a discussion in the pub is going to be a very different context critically to, say, a seminar room in a university. Religious organization, again, will be a very different sort of context. And you have to take that into account in interpreting and identifying assumptions. So you always need to ask really, so what are people trying to do? What are their intentions? But the next couple of points, interpretation and credibility, I think are particularly crucial for the uncertain times theme of this retreat. So I'm going to say more about those, and we'll discuss those a bit more in a minute. So interpretation, generally speaking, is about judging what other people are meaning to say or write. What do they intend? And obviously, it's possible to interpret people in an unnecessarily negative or sometimes unnecessarily positive way. Anyway, I'll come back to that in a minute. The credibility is the art of finding reliable information, really, and judging information from other sources when you're not in a position to investigate it for yourself. So particularly if it's something very technical or something that's about events that you're not party to, you know, what happened in America in the 19th century, you know, what is really going on in particle physics, you know, I haven't a clue. Look at what the experts say, you know, how credible is what they say. And then finally, bias and fallacy awareness. So there's a lot of different biases which influence the way that we think, and those can be have been formally identified also as fallacies, that is, mistakes of thinking of various sorts. That again can be very helpful way of identifying, sort of negatively identifying mistakes that you're making in your thinking. And there's a lot of work on biases and fallacies in my book, Middle Way Philosophy 4. There's sort of a long list of them and ways you can identify them and how they relate to the middle way and so on. I'm not going to say a lot about biases and fallacies in this talk, but it's a important aspect of critical thinking. Okay, so that's just a very brief sort of reminder or kind of what critical thinking might be, and I suppose why it's relevant to the middle way, and also why I think it's really not just an academic exercise. It's something that everybody needs to be engaging with as far as possible, and I think it can be engaged with at a number of different levels. You know? So you can introduce people quite simply just to being aware of their assumptions in some ways as a starting point. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is to focus on one of those points a bit more. So starting with credibility, because credibility is particularly relevant to the sort of uncertain times theme, I think. And then I'm going to get you to discuss that a bit. So yeah, credibility is wrapped up also with the issues of authority. So in uncertain times, people often make shortcuts in terms of their sources of information. And we see that particularly with things like conspiracy theories, say. So if people just see one thing on the internet, which seems to provide a complete explanation of the things that they're experiencing, and also obviously fits their feelings about it and their responses about it, then they will latch on to that source and take it to be the complete explanation. And from that point, they interpret everything else in its terms. So that's an example of what you could call, well, technically it's called the genetic fallacy. So believing that something is true because of where you got it from. So it's genesis, its origins. Or another word for it is the appeal to authority. So if somebody points to a particular source of information and assumes that what is said is correct because of where it comes from, then that involves an absolutizing way of thinking. So you assume that you've had the whole picture because of where you got your information. And there are lots of different versions of this, which I'm sure will be familiar to you. So there's the fundamentalist appeal to the Bible, for example. So you find a verse about the Bible, for example, in Leviticus 19. There's a verse which gives a justification against homosexuality, practice of homosexuality. And that then becomes the sort of thing you refer to, which tells you God's will about that particular moral issue. And that's entirely regardless of the issues of interpreting that verse, the context in which it occurred, you know, why you're interested in the first place, its relationship to all the other verses in the Bible. So it's a very complex issue to interpret Leviticus 19, and of course it's a very complex issue to determine your responses to something like homosexuality. So the fundamentalism is an obvious example, but people can also do this with experts of one kind or another. So the idea here, if it's necessarily true because the expert said it, needs to be very carefully distinguished, I think, from it's highly credible because an expert said it. So you can have a strong reason for being confident in an expert without believing that the expert is infallible or that they have an absolute perspective on what they're saying. So that would be my attitude, for example, to a doctor who advises me on a medical issue. Generally speaking, obviously there may be exceptions. I would tend to trust that expert because they know far more about what they're talking about than I do. So that gives them a lot of credibility, but it's still possible that they're wrong. So I won't assume that they're wrong unless I've got some other reason for thinking that they might be wrong. So that introduces us, I suppose, to the distinction between absolute authority on the one hand and credibility. So absolute authority is a shortcut. It's an absolutization of the kind that people are much more likely to make under stress. But that, of course, they might do it anyway. They're not under stress. So just because it's easier, in the ways I discussed a bit yesterday. So one of the ways we can work with that and try and avoid either explicitly or implicitly absolutizing authorities is to use credibility and think about credibility in a more explicit way. So that's where the critical thinking practice of credibility comes in. It involves thinking explicitly about why a particular source is credible or not so credible. And there are a number of factors you might need to take into account to do that. So some of them, a lot of this you might already be doing, but I think it's quite helpful to have a kind of a more systematic way of reflecting on it. So in my experience, most people haven't come across, the idea of doing this systematically. So I'm going to show you another picture now, diagram of a very useful little mnemonic. So the Raven Mnemonic, so the Raven stands for 5 what are known as credibility factors. So 5 things you can have on your checklist, if you like, to think about when you're considering whether a particular source, whether it's a book or an expert or a neighbor or whoever it is or whatever it is, your source of information, whether it's to what extent it's a trustworthy source of information. So this is all about to what extent, and all of these factors are a matter of degree. And they all help us, I think, to start thinking about this as a matter of degree, rather than, oh, I must believe that, or I must disbelieve that completely. So just to run through these 5 factors. So reputation, is obviously based on probably what other people tell you about a particular source. Has it been reliable in the past? So, for example, I don't take Donald Trump as a particularly reliable source of information because he's got a long track record of giving out false information or inconsistent information. You could say the same, obviously, about different media sources. Think about what their reputation is. So that could apply to newspapers, for example, or to individual experts or whatever. But of course, that's a fallible thing. You know, somebody could have a bad reputation and still be right. So it's just something to throw into the pot, something to take into account. Similarly with the others. So ability to observe. So if somebody is telling you about what happened in an accident, were they there to watch it? Did they see what actually happened? If somebody is telling you secret information about the deep state, so-called, have they been able to observe it? Do they have access to the deep state? Do they know what's going on in government? I'd be more inclined to give them credence if they do, or rather than if they're just speculating from somewhere else. Vested interest is a very interesting one. So somebody has a strong reason to get you to believe something or to disbelieve it. And that's an obvious problem in politics, that people will have vested interests in supporting their party, for example, or dissing the other party. But of course, you can have the same thing with professions. You know, farmers will defend their current agricultural practices and so on. And of course, this isn't absolute. If somebody has a vested interest, it doesn't mean they're necessarily wrong at all. In fact, a vested interest in some cases is just a reason for being concerned about the issue. You know, a teacher has a vested interest in the success of their students. Doesn't mean that their advice to their students is necessarily wrong, of course. But it's something to take into account. Expertise. So how much expertise somebody has, obviously, is it relevant? And then neutrality or bias is more about somebody's track record in being able to consider different points of view, or will they always present information in a biased way? Do they have a track record of doing that? So it's a bit different from vested interest because it's about how they actually presented things in that way. So if you try and take all of these into account and weigh them up, then they can contribute to developing a helpfully complex picture of the source that you're using, relatively good or bad it is, so that you can make an appropriate judgment about it. So it can be a reflection point. But it's quite common though for any of these factors to be absolutized. So for somebody to just rely on one of them, and for example, to use that as a reason for dismissing a source of information. So somebody hasn't got a PhD, so therefore they've got no expertise, or somebody did one bad thing in the past. So I know a good example. Yes, the Liberal Democrats betrayed the students on their student loans. They went against their previous announced policies when they joined the coalition in 2010. So therefore, you can't trust the Liberal Democrats. Yeah. So if you can just therefore light on one thing and assume that gives you the whole picture, then that is an absolutization of that factor. So it's important to try and keep it incremental as a matter of degree. Then at the bottom, we've got two ravens. So just another element to consider here is that obviously in many cases you've got more than one source, and those sources will all be subject to a Raven analysis. But another question you might ask is, do they agree with each other? Do they corroborate? Or do they conflict with each other? And again, it's just something else to throw into the pot. If lots of people say the same thing, it doesn't necessarily mean they're right, but it gives you more confidence in them being right. Okay, so I hope that's yeah, can provide sort of useful basis of set of reflections. But I think it's particularly at stake. You know, obviously you can't use this for everything. You know, we haven't got time to apply it consciously to everything. But where we get into disputed areas, particularly the kind of polarized political debates that we really see today, often about things that it's difficult to judge if we haven't got the right expertise or the right access to the issues. Particular issues that spring to mind today, debates that are going on where maybe credibility analysis might be helpful. Vaccination. So, you know, I know that there are probably some people present with different views about this. So it's you know, whether vaccination is a reliable, whether you should take the COVID vaccination, whether it's a reliable thing to use in society. Climate change, obviously. So where do you get your sources of information? What source of information do you trust? If there are some people who seem to have quite a lot of expertise, who have maverick views on climate change, who tell us it's not such a big deal, then how far should we trust those views, as opposed to what seems to be the large-scale consensus among scientists? Or recently, the effectiveness of masks. Again, so there's a situation there, I think, with you know, a few apparently expert people saying, oh, well, these masks are not as effective as the mainstream are telling us. How seriously do we take that? And of course, it's possible to put a lot of energy into such debates, maybe more than they deserve, but we also have to make judgments about them, and possibly also have to respond practically to people who we might get into conflict with about these issues. So I want to say a little bit, actually, some of the stuff that's come up in the discussion we just had prompts me to talk a little bit, I think, about the language we use. But I also want to talk about interpretation and justification. So I think those are aspects of practice, of critical thinking practice, that are particularly relevant to at certain times. Yeah, the language issue. Now, the language issue is probably the heart of a lot of the issues people have with critical thinking. So I think I kind of mentioned in discussion that there are certain kind of alert words which probably can often indicate, particularly to us. Okay. Anyway, yes. So words like completely or essentially, just, all. So very often those can be kind of sweeping generalization words. Yeah. So when we've got some sort of complex thing we're talking about, and we say, well, it's all like that, or it's just like this. But of course, we have to be careful with the conclusions we draw about that, because in a particular context, it may be clear that somebody means to be quite provisional about that. So they're just exploring ideas, or they've perhaps open to considering whether in fact it is all this thing that's the case. So, but provisional language, I think, is a very helpful part of critical thinking practice. So, and I think this is very much a matter of personal responsibility more than anything. So not so much policing other people's language, but keeping an eye on one's own language as far as possible. And I don't claim to be a paragon myself. I do slip up on the language I use sometimes. So trying to talk to incrementally, yeah, so saying things like to a large extent rather than completely, for example, or perhaps mentioning that what we're concluding is based on a weight of evidence, that this is what we think on the evidence so far. So it seems to me, you could just say, or based on what I've seen, this is the case. And I think maybe, well, let's take an example. So supposing somebody has a really bad experience in a hospital, maybe under the COVID crisis. So they go into the hospital, they have to wait 8 hours on a trolley in the corridor before they get seen to. And they come back saying, the hospitals are in crisis, the NHS is failing us. And so that's kind of absolute language about the entire NHS. And actually, even in that hospital, there are lots of people being treated. And maybe you had a very bad time and you waited far too long, but you still got treated eventually. So it's not as though nobody was being treated. And if you looked in other hospitals, it might well be fine. So it's just bearing in mind that you've only got a certain part of the picture at each stage. Yeah, trying to make allowances for that before we bring in the absolute language to describe our conclusions. And that's all about the practice of provisionality, I think. And perhaps probably the trouble with so I suppose pointing to language in this way is that people associate it with pedantry, maybe, or even with kind of language policing stuff. So political correctness has perhaps put a lot of people's backs up because they react to what they see as other people trying to police their language. And sometimes that's fair enough. But I would see it just as an issue of awareness, really, that so being aware of our language can be an aspect of the practice of provisionality. And so it's not a question of trying to score points by being more precise than somebody else, but of just trying to be a bit more precise ourselves, because that's more adequate to what we're talking about and might help to avoid needless conflict as well. So I think that's a general thing. I mean, it's related to what in critical thinking is known as the fallacy of sweeping generalization, that is, of making very general statements that aren't justified. Anyway, I want to say a little bit also about interpretation, because I think that's another area that's particularly at stake when people get stressed, or when they, particularly when there's a difficult situation in society at large, and when they get in polarized groups. And how we interpret other people as well, I think, is again particularly a matter of feelings and emotions. So it's not just a question of reasoning at all. And particularly this comes in when on the internet, particularly, so where you've got fewer contextual clues, you've just got a bit of text that somebody's written to go on, and it's so easy just to pile on assumptions about what the other person is saying. We sort of tend to automatically construct our own context for what they're saying, rather than bearing in mind that the context might be totally different from what we assume. And I think that comes in particularly where we're interpreting someone else as being on the other side of an argument, because we're probably looking for certain clues, and I think this is kind of ground into us really by our social context quite often, that we're used to picking up clues that people are similar to us or that they're different from us. And those clues might come from their language, the kind of style, the cultural references they make, maybe the people they refer to, the authorities they name, that sort of thing. So just to give try and bring this into the kind of debate you might find on the internet at the moment. Say if I mention the name Jordan Peterson, now does that make you bristle, or does it make you think, oh well, that's good or interesting or whatever? So you can get extreme reactions to that name, and there's some debate about how far that's justified. Who knows? But I suspect that my personal view that I've arrived at on this is that he's probably quite a complex thinker in some ways, but his supporters' view of him may be quite oversimplified quite often. Yeah, if you get a controversial figure like that, that can act as a cultural reference. So if somebody quotes Jordan Peterson, you might immediately think, oh, here's a rabid right winger, so I'm going to react to this person or whatever. Yeah, there are other kinds of phrases that may be typical of one political group or another. So if I use the term cancel culture, yeah, so that's often used by generally right-wingers complaining about the left. They may have a good point to make, but often that point gets submerged in a polarized then discussion, which assumes absolute. So you assume lots of other things about them, that they've got lots of other right-wing views, for example, because they might use that phrase. And obviously there might be the other way around. If somebody mentions Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, in a favorable way, do you then assume that they're on the left and so on? So there are clues like that people then tend to react to. So often this kind of issue of interpretation is about assuming an antagonism or creating an antagonism where it's not necessary, and then constructing a whole story, a backstory to it that's not necessarily there. And there is another side to that, which is also, of course, it can act positively. So you could construct a positive story, an idealized positive story as well, based on clues that somebody is like you. So you assume then that they agree with you about everything, and actually they may be quite different from you and have very different views. So it can cut both ways, but usually where it's more likely to be an issue is, of course, when it results in antagonism, particularly on the internet. And generally in critical thinking, as a sort of way of trying to avoid this, as a practice to try and avoid this kind of scenario, there's the principle of charity. So the principle of charity is basically making a favorable assumption in our interpretation of somebody, where there is doubt, where there is reasonable doubt about aspects of what they are saying or mean or intend, then it's better to assume what you would find favorable than otherwise. Because if you assume the best of them, then that allows engagement in which you can continue to have a dialogue, and then you might establish more in more detail what they do actually think, as opposed to assuming that something negative about them. Okay, so the principle of charity is tricky in some ways, obviously, because it can be unrealistic. We do depend a lot on these social clues, even, particularly on the internet, but also off the internet as well. And you can only take it to a certain degree. You can't always assume the best of everybody. And there are, or we need to be able to have debates with people who we disagree with and identify them as disagreeing. You can't hold out indefinitely. But it's more about how we interpret ambiguous information and how we deal with doubt, and that's obviously also about sort of holding off just a little bit in the way that we make our judgments, being provisional. Okay, so that's another skill which I think we could possibly discuss a bit later. I mean, an example that you might want to think about there, say take a phrase like, in American politics, defund the police. How do you interpret that slogan? Or perhaps a bit closer to home, given that I think we're all British, at least in origin or residence. Get Brexit done. How do you react to that slogan? What assumptions do you make about it when somebody uses it? Anyway, perhaps we'll come back to that. Now the other final issue I just want to mention is about justification in general. So reaching a conclusion, what in critical thinking might often be described as the reasoning process, but what is it that finally determines the conclusion you reach about something? Particularly, I think the application of the middle way here requires that we don't just take one point and assume that this seals the issue. Yeah, particularly in a, when we're talking about something complex, which we usually are, to be honest, in most issues are complex issues. So that means the alternative to that is weighing up. So getting a sense of there being different possible points on either side, but also how strong those points are, how much weight you should give them. And this, if you think in terms of weighing up, that can also alert you to whether there are absolutes involved anyway. So an absolute is not weighed up. An absolute is not put in with other things. An absolute just tips the scale instantly. If you've got an absolute, you just conclude that must be true. So it can alert you to the fact that there's an absolute at work in your own thinking or someone else's thinking. But when we weigh things up, then there are obviously various ways that we can give them weight, as it were. So metaphorically, obviously, we're talking about weight. So it could be about probability, for example. So how likely is it that if you go into hospital, you won't be treated within a 2-hour margin or something? Or how likely is it that the British economy will decline by 10% in this year or something? Now, obviously, that takes you into quite technical territory, potentially statistical territory. But I don't think we don't always need to be precise about probability in order to think probabilistically. So you don't need to become like a statistics wonk in order to start saying things like, well, it's quite likely, based on what I've seen, that this is the case. And that just by itself takes you away from an absolutized way of thinking about it. If you start talking in terms of likelihood instead. Obviously, if you can be more precise, that's great. But there can also be fake precision. Yeah, so somebody might give a statistic, but the statistic has a context, and it's easy to take that out of context. So it's obviously possible to give too much weight to a specific statistic. That doesn't mean statistics in general aren't helpful. Then there's things like strength of justification. So how important is the thing that we're talking about? How strong is the case? How reliable is it? And the credibility of the sources. So we said a bit about that earlier. Particularly, are there a lot of sources saying the same thing? Is there a consensus view about this? Well, that doesn't tell you that it's necessarily true what is being said in consensus, but it should give a weight to that view. And then So yeah, let me give you an example of this kind of weighing up from my recent experience, because this was quite an interesting conversation I had recently on Facebook. So these interesting conversations do happen on Facebook, interestingly. I got into conversation with a farmer, and I'm a non-absolute vegan, right? So I've been a vegan, not a vegan in terms of purity, but an overwhelming vegan, 99% vegan for about 25 years. And obviously that's based on a certain view of animal agriculture and its effects. But yeah, so this happened in the context of, I won't go into all the details about why it was, but there, in that particular place, there was some debate about, well, it began with farmers' responses to veganism and objections to veganism, and obviously feeling threatened by it. But now, obviously, that has potential for a lot of polarization. But I was quite proud of myself because we seem to have avoided that. I got into discussion with one farmer, and we remained polite to each other. And in the end, he stopped responding. I don't know why, but at least we had a reasonable conversation. And but the way this involved weighing up is that he came up with a couple of interesting points, I think, or perhaps helpful points. One of them was, first of all, was about the strength of British, because this was the context of British farming, yeah. So the strength of British standards when it came to animal farming. And then he talked about carbon sequestration. So there's an interesting point, I think, about the fact that pasture, it seems, from the research, sequesters more carbon even than forest does. So that's an interesting point, and in fact, one should not ignore it, I think, if one is a vegan, say. But what I wanted to do, and what I did do then in my debate with this farmer, is to say, well, yes, okay, that's a good point. I agree with that, and I can see the evidence for it, and I checked it as well. But then there are all these other points. So, for example, there's land use. So the overall use by animal agriculture of land. So there's a lot of land used for pasture, and then there's a whole lot more land used to produce feed for animal agriculture, which would not be necessary if there was more people relying on plant food, or overwhelmingly relying on plant food. The weight of land use makes a difference. So whether or not the land that we might free up if we ate more plants is necessarily forested, I think it would have great advantages if it was forested, but there might be other uses for it as well. And exactly, there's a lot of complexity there, isn't there? It's exactly what land is suitable for what. And then there's the whole area of biodiversity, which is, as far as I understand it, much greater in forests than it is on pasture. So the fact that, for example, in the British uplands, we've got so much more, so much bare pasture, green desert type terrain, hugely reduces biodiversity. And biodiversity has often been seen as almost as big a threat to the planet as climate change. And then there's cruelty. So the whole way in which animals are treated in the agriculture industry, including things like live transportation, slaughterhouse stress, which also affects the slaughterhouse workers, and of course the close confinement in factory farming. And the abuse of antibiotics, which has been a major contribution to the crisis in antibiotic effectiveness in the world at large. So as I can see, Oh, and then there's methane. Yeah, not forgetting the methane. So all the things that livestock are producing, which are adding hugely to climate change gases, global warming gases. So yes, there are some crucial points that can be made to defend animal agriculture, including carbon sequestration. Another one is the use of animal manure and whether that should be part of a cycle of an effective agriculture, more permaculture type system. But when I try and weigh that up with all those other points, for me, the balance is pretty clear. It's towards maybe not total veganism for everybody, but for drastically reducing the amount of meat and animal products we consume. So that's my personal conclusion on that issue. So I just wanted to give that as an illustration of weighing up. Yeah. So you could take I think that the farmer I was discussing this with took the carbon sequestration point, and for him that decided the issue. It seemed, yeah. So because of carbon sequestration, therefore it was acceptable to carry on with animal agriculture. For me, that's not enough because of all these other points as well. So I'd say that's the kind of thing we need to do whenever there's a complex political issue, and that probably means looking at different sources and yeah, where different arguments will be made and different conditions will be pointed out. Okay, so just to summarize then, so I've talked a bit about using provisional language, and I've talked a bit about the principle of charity, and I've talked a bit about weighing up rather than taking one point as clinching a whole issue. So I think those are three kind of important elements of what I'd see as a middle way practice of critical thinking, which might help us in any times, but particularly uncertain times. Okay, so I think we've got about 15 minutes left. So maybe we can just use this for some general discussion. Yeah. So any questions or points you want to make in response to that? So Brenda,
can I fire off on that?
Yeah, by all means.
Yes, I was very interested in your point about emotive language, and how emotive language can actually stop us having the debates that we need to do to fully understand other people's points of view. You picked Jordan Peterson, who, whatever your viewpoints, is a controversial figure, but I would be kept in my own viewpoints if I didn't have the opportunity to explore what people like him are saying, to say, well, where is this guy coming from? What is all this about? And without being labelled, without being lumped in the, oh, you're 100% pro this person. We need to have that debate, and it's actually, and to get those viewpoints, where is that farmer coming from? Otherwise, we're the poorer for it, and it doesn't come to a conclusion. But a lot of that is blocked by emotive language, you know, or you shouldn't do this, or, you know, got to be a bit careful there and everything else. And then I'd like to come on to the point you made about charity and charitable thinking, in the sense that, again, we need a certain amount of openness. We need a certain amount of trust. Okay, trust can be betrayed again and again and again, but we need to give people the chance. Yes, there's the narcissists in this world who utilize our trust against us, but again, we need to be open to a certain extent. Otherwise, we can never redirect our thinking. And yes, we're encouraging a whole lack of inquiry, which doesn't encourage resolution. And I'd love to come back on those points you made about the father and talk to you about that, but I won't do that here. But I think that was a very worthwhile and interesting conversation and reflection. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah. Great.
I find your point very interesting. Thank you. Am I audible?
You are, yes, yes.
Okay. I just wanted to ask you two brief, quite succinct questions, actually. And that is, how did you get into that conversation with the farmer? And would you have a similar conversation again?
Okay, well, how did I get into it? I got into it by, it came up on my feed for some reason. I got this response from I think it was the Farmers Weekly, responding to a college student union, I think, which ran Veganuary or promoted Veganuary. Why that came up in my feed, I have no idea, but anyway, it did. And I decided to try a carefully phrased limited response and see what happened, just to try and get out of the bubble. So there's this big issue with echo chambers, obviously, in social media. So from time to time, I try moving beyond the echo chamber, and I feel I have to move very carefully indeed, but I think it's worth having a go. So on this occasion, I did. And I think what worked there was that most of the people on that who obviously had that set of responses in their feeds didn't notice what I'd said, but this particular guy did. So I ended up just having a conversation with him, and nobody else pitched in at that point. So yeah, would I have that again?
Oh,
well,
sorry, just a little ancillary question to that. Was he a livestock farmer?
I suspect so. I didn't ask him that, but he was either a farmer or closely allied with farming, obviously. Yeah. So yeah, if it had all gone polarized, I would have rapidly backed out and stopped responding. But it didn't. So we ended up having a reasonable conversation. So that to me seemed worth doing, and it's the kind of thing that social media enables, which wouldn't otherwise happen at all. I wouldn't walk into a farmers meeting and start debating veganism with them. It just wouldn't happen. There are plus points with social media as well as negative ones, depending on how you use it.
Got a comment.
Okay. That was my second question.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I repeat it.
Oh, sorry. Yes, your second question.
The one I asked before was, would you do it again in some shape or form to try and, as it were, take things further to more connection?
As I think I said, yes, I would, as long as it continued to work to the same extent. Yeah, as long as we didn't fall into polarization. Yeah. Anyway, Barry.
Yeah, I just think when you're saying, giving it a go, when I think about my own experience like this, in my 20s, I thought everyone could be reached, and then hit my 30s and 40s and thought life's too short, I can't be bothered. And I've come round again now, somewhere in between the middle of those two extremes, really. But I'm just thinking, when you say giving it a go, if I've found in my own experience, if there's someone is if someone's an absolute extreme, I found in my experience that it's very, very difficult to actually have a meaningful conversation. What you can do there is perhaps try and find some common ground on something. I'm thinking about family here. We, some members of family just don't do politics and stuff. But then where the more fruitful conversations tend to happen, where there is where maybe you're not too far away, so say someone is a progressive, fairly left wing, you've got a better chance with someone who's fairly right wing to actually have to make that effort, because we are time constrained in terms of the effort we want to put into these engagements to an extent. So I just wonder what your experience is of that. Where do you where do you have a go, or do you think, oh no, that's not going to work?
There's a lot of serendipity to it, isn't there? That, you know,
Yeah.
does the opportunity arise? Do you have the time at the point when it does arise, and so on? And there's a real issue about how much time you invest in these things and how fruitful it is.
And whether you consider you're right or not, because I think there's a lot of things that encourage us to think that we're somehow superior or we know best. I mean, I'm sure as former members of the FWBO, you will be aware of how you were encouraged to think that you were superior. Healers suffer from the same problem. And if we're coming to debate with the, well, we're determined that we're right, really, and that you somehow ought to change your views because I'm right and you're wrong, you're not going to get very far. And it is difficult to stand back. I do sympathise with what Barry's saying about members of the family with completely opposing views, perhaps. To actually always have to stand back, particularly when you see the consequences of some of their views, and take a deep breath and say, this is their life, they're on their path. You know? This is not up to me to change the world.
You may not succeed in changing them, but I think the point is that thinking that you're right and someone else is wrong is an absolute way of judging the situation, isn't it?
Yeah, and
so if
doesn't
you
work.
are genuinely trying to be provisional, then you're definitely increasing your chances of both communicating something and learning something. You know, so I learned more about carbon sequestration from that exchange I had with the farmer, because I made the effort then to check that my understanding of it was correct and that it was actually based on evidence, which it is. So it's not just a question, I think, of thinking that you're right. And
I'm sharing my own frailty. I'm sharing that I can fall back into that position if I'm not careful.
Right. Yeah.
And that it's actually an ongoing working lesson to actually breathe, take that step back and think, right, let's open things up a bit here and not be so black and white about things.
Yeah, quite. Yeah. George.
Yeah, I just think one of your ideas, Robert, about objectivity is really important in this sort of dialogue that we're having just now about my view is correct. Well, if you believe in objectivity and it's possible to become slightly more objective in a response to a situation, and that's the point that you're coming from, then there does seem to be something that's more useful or not. But if you come to it from just the point of view of, well, my view is right and that's it, then there's not much chance of change. But once you get to that common ground of saying, okay, there is some kind of objective tendency or ability here in relation to the circumstances, then if you set it in that context, then you've got more chance, I think, of actually having a dialogue which opens people up. So I found that very useful. Although I do find it sometimes quite difficult to get clear about your ideas about what makes something more objective as opposed to relative. And I think that's a slippery one for a lot of us to try and get our heads around.
Yeah, I mean, it's easy to misunderstand. I mean, I guess that's probably why I use that term less than I used to, but because people take objectivity as meaning a God's eye view or an absolute position, and they often use it in that sense, whereas I intended it in an incremental sense. I mean, also adequacy might be helpful as well there, so being more adequate to the conditions.
I also find when I'm sometimes getting hijacked about being right is always try to think that for me what my objective is what is the best for the situation, and that it might include my needs as well. Well, that does include, I'm part of the mix too. I think you can go the other extreme and be selfless, which is wrong either as well, but it's that often brings me back and stops me being so hijacked.
Jyoti, you're muted, Jyoti.
Am I audible?
Yep.
Yeah, responding to what George and Barry were alluding to. Question to you, Robert. I was very interested when you introduced idea of the importance of charity. Would you, when faced with one of these potentially quite polarized situations, or whether it's where it's sort of heavy weather, the person is quite entrenched, I'm interested in how far you take charity, assuming you thought there was some mileage in it, there's something here to be worked on, not just a pointless exercise. And would you, for example, take the charity to the extent of being psychologically aware of what may be driving them? Their feeling of anxiety, their feeling of inadequacy, their feeling they need to hold their own end up, their feeling of vulnerability. And would you even go so far as to, actively empathize with that?
Yeah, hopefully. Obviously, that depends a lot on one's mental state and emotional state at the time. But and I think, but obviously there are limits to how far you can make allowances for somebody's psychological or emotional state. There's such a thing as kind of a psychological reduction, which I think people sometimes indulge in discussion. So they say, you're just saying that because of your psychological state, which involves not taking the content of what you're saying seriously. So I think at some level we have to continue to engage with the content of what someone's saying, but obviously you can perhaps, if for example they've been triggered in some way into an absolutization, and then you just feel perhaps recognizing that there's not much more you can do. So maybe that's probably the point where I'd stop inputting into that conversation if I could. Or, I mean, if it was face to face, then it's different. You'd have to engage in that relationship in different ways. As Barry suggested earlier, be positive, say, or talk about something you can relate to.
Part of the trouble is finding.
Just to say, it seems quite often we can be the trigger for somebody.
Quite often, what, sorry?
We can be the trigger.
Yeah.
Unwittingly. They're triggered by something about us, not that we've consciously done or said anything. And so my sense is we have some responsibility for being the trigger, even if we're unwitting and we're innocent.
Yeah.
But if they are being triggered by us, or because somebody heard I was a Buddhist, and that set them going, or whatever it was, or a vegan, then it seems we have some responsibility there to at least own up, and maybe that helps to diffuse things as well, make it more conscious.
Part of the trouble is that we don't often get the time or the right context to do this. I found myself 2 years ago standing in the giant American war cemetery outside Luxembourg City from the Battle of the Bulge, surrounded by all the triumphalist design that the Americans tend to use for their cemeteries. And I encountered this visitor who was a good old boy from somewhere in the Midwest, who immediately launched in onto how wonderful President Trump was and how wonderful things he was going to do for America and all this sort of thing. Now, clearly, he was looking back to what the Americans had achieved in the Second World War. I would have loved to have gone on with the conversation and sort of tried to find out what his context was, where precisely he lived, why he felt this. But obviously that was not the place to do it. A few months ago, when I was in the ticket office of the Steam Railway, I had some old age pensioner come up to me and demand to know why we were not running more trains than the 2 a day we were. And when I explained that it was due to the international COVID crisis, he told me that this didn't exist. It was all a fantasy of our minds. Now, clearly, I would have loved to have tried to deconstruct with him why he might have thought that. But clearly, in neither of these cases, was this the right circumstance in which to do it?
Yeah. I mean, that's an interesting one for, that perhaps on social media, sometimes anyway, it's easier to actually start like those conversations than it would be if you're selling someone a ticket or whatever. Yes.
The other thing is that very often the communication isn't there. Here in East Kent, for example, we have it's only 25 miles away from Dover, but we have no active correspondence with the residents of Calais. There is no column once a month in the East Kent Gazette, but from the Voix du Nord, the northern Northern French newspaper or something like that. I have the fortunate advantage of having a certain working knowledge of French and Dutch. I actually have a satellite receiver that receives French television, and things like this. If only the residents of East Kent, who are in many cases quite poor, had more understanding of the similar problems there were in northern France, for example, that there might be more dialogue. But I mean, it's one of the reasons why, for example, people regard, to say, the Dutch or the Germans as being abrupt and direct is it's physically the grammar of their language translated into English. Better communication very often would always help.
Yeah, great. Okay, well, I think we better be winding up there. So thanks to everyone for their contributions. Recording.